Hi, everyone. Welcome to Transitions. I'm Anne Wagner, and I'm your host, broadcasting from the beautiful downtown Bracebridge studio of Hunters Bay at Nipissing University. Today, my guest is Suzanne Witt-Foley, a mental health educator. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm thrilled you could come back and visit with us again. And so today, we're going to talk about the importance of educating people about mental health issues. And I know you have considerable experience in this area. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about why you think it's important that we do educate the public.
I would love to. Yes, I think that public education around mental health is really an important thing to do, basically. Mental illness really, I think, is very common. And looks like in Canada it may be on the rise. And so let me just talk a little bit about a few statistics. What we do know is that in any given year in Canada, 1 in 5 people will be experiencing a mental illness. And in fact, 1 in 3 will experience a mental illness at some point in their lives. So it's very, very common, right? If it's not yourself, it might be a loved one, a family member, a friend, a colleague. Very, very prevalent.
And I think that's an important point you're making because it's so common, yet we don't commonly talk about it.
Yeah, and we don't know a lot about it. Right? There's a lot of things I think that a lot of us know a fair bit about, but mental illness is probably not one of them.
Absolutely, I would agree.
Yeah. Just a few other things that are pointing to this being a concern and a reason for us to learn is that we know from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in 2013 that 2.2% of Ontario adults seriously considered suicide in that year. So that's 230,000 people in 1 year seriously considered suicide.
That's astounding and disturbing.
It is. And we know that in Canada, 4,000 people per year die by suicide. And most of them do have, not all, but many do have mental illness. So the more that we can all be aware and have an understanding about mental illness, the more we'll all be able to be understanding and support other people.
So I'm just wondering, is this common globally, universally, these issues with mental health, or does it depend on the context, the place, the situation?
Yeah, my understanding is that mental illness rates are not the same everywhere. Wilkinson and Pickett wrote a book in 2009 called The Spirit Level, and some really interesting research comes out of that book. They talk about how the prevalence of mental illness is actually higher in more unequal countries, and not necessarily rich or poor countries. And I'll give you an example. The United States is the wealthiest country in the world, and yet the United States actually has the highest rates of mental illness, where 1 in 4 people will experience a mental illness. In Canada, it's 1 in 5 within any given year. Other countries like Japan, Belgium, or Germany, it's closer to 1 in 10. So we know that there's a variety of circumstances that might be driving mental illness up or down. And although probably today in our discussion, we won't get into that too much, but just to say that, yes, Canada, our rates do seem to be going up. It's not necessarily going up everywhere, but because we're seeing increasing rates, it's really important for us to be educated about this issue and know how to support one another.
And so when you mentioned that it seems to be linked to whether a society is unequal or there are great inequities, could that be disparity in resources in supports?
It could be. What they are looking more specifically at is inequity in terms of wealth. And so it's not necessarily that a wealthier country will have less mental illness. In fact, there's no relationship there at all. But what we do know is the gap between the rich and the poor is what is driving rates of mental illness and many other social ills as well. And so it has more to do with how wealth is distributed rather than how much wealth is actually, within a country or within a certain place.
And that's really important to orient our thinking around that, So we're not really protected from it here in Canada because we do have wealth disparity, income disparity in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell me a little bit about why public education around mental health is important?
Public education is really important for a whole host of reasons. As we talked about, mental illness is very common. And as I said as well, that it does begin in youth. A lot of times the signs and symptoms start to develop with young people. And so if we can intervene early, we know that we will have better outcomes. Even when you think in terms of brain science, if somebody is starting to experience anxiety and that anxiety continues on and on, every time they have that experience, it carves a brain pathway deeper and deeper in their brain. So eventually, if you wait, let's say 10 years to get treatment and help, there are some very ingrained brain pathways that you're going to have to work at changing. If we can intervene early, those pathways aren't well laid down yet and are much simpler at shifting, what's going to happen with that person in terms of their anxiety or whatever they're experiencing.
So that seems to also speak to your point about we need to have education for the public because we need to be able to have some idea of what we're looking for or how to respond when we're starting to pick up on cues, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. In addition, we know that treatments have really improved and changed over the years, and people are having much better outcomes. I don't think the general public is necessarily aware of that yet. When I talk to people in the public, a lot of folks are still thinking about mental illness in terms of really terrible medications that have a lot of side effects. They're thinking about hospitalization. I know that, 25 years ago, people were much more commonly hospitalized because we didn't have really good treatments. I like to compare with Terry Fox. If we think about Terry Fox, who died about 25 years ago, if he were alive today and had the same cancer today, experts say he would survive. Our treatments for cancer have come an awfully long way in 25 years, and that we would be able to provide him with, appropriate treatment and have, good chances of survival. It's very much the same with mental illness. We have much better treatments now than we did 25 years ago. And for people who are experiencing mental illness, those supports can make, a huge difference.
So part of the public education then would be letting people know that these treatments are available.
Yes.
And that they're very effective often, and they're not going to radically negatively impact your life.
Right.
In the way that we may see from old movies, for example.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The way that psychiatry in general was portrayed many years ago. I think of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I would never want to put myself in the position of seeking treatment if that were still the way it is.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot that we've been learning today as well about different kinds of treatments and supports that really work. Things, just to digress for a minute, things that I used to consider fluff. For example, mindfulness. I can remember 10, 15 years ago thinking, well, that's just kind of for the kumbaya crowd. I can't really see how it's going to have an impact. And, today I eat my words because the research coming out around mindfulness practice and how it is having a tremendous impact on mental health is really quite profound. And there's a lot of other things that we can do as well that are simple strategies like physical activity that can have really profound impacts on illness.
So that's a really important point because I think oftentimes we tend to immediately think of medications and side effects of drugs, but those aren't our only options. There's a host of other strategies
yes,
for supporting people with mental health challenges.
You want to have use the analogy of your ingredients for soup. Right? You want to have the right ingredients and the right ingredients for you. And you want to have, that whole toolkit, if you will. And what works for some people may not necessarily work for other people. But building, your toolkit, it's not just one tool in the basket, but, or one ingredient in the soup, but having, the full menu.
Well, that's a really important point. And we're just going to go to break to briefly hear from our sponsors, and then we'll be back to hear more from Suzanne Witt-Foley. Welcome back to Transitions. We're talking with Suzanne Witt-Foley today. And Suzanne, you were telling us about some of the benefits and why public education is important regarding mental health.
Yeah, and I wanted to also mention a really important reason why public education is so important, and that has to do with stigma. Public education reduces stigma. There are a lot of myths out there, and really when we fear something, when we don't understand something, as humans, we tend to fear it. And so if we don't understand mental illness, we tend to fear. And if we fear, we avoid, right? So we might avoid working with, or we might avoid renting to, or we might avoid spending time because of that fear. And that creates stigma. So if we can create understanding, then we reduce the fear and in a sense, reduce the stigma. The other thing I wanted to mention about public education is that a lot of people in the general public don't know how to respond if somebody's experiencing a mental health issue. They're afraid of doing the wrong thing, right? And if we're afraid of doing the wrong thing, then we might just back away and do nothing. And so through public education, we can teach people what to do, how to respond. And it's not rocket science, the kinds of things that we can learn. They're really simple skills that many of us already have. We just didn't know that those were the tools we're supposed to use.
And you made a really important point when we were chatting before the show. You were saying that we're all well versed in physical first aid, but why not mental health first aid?
Yes, yeah, exactly. One of the questions that I ask in mental health first aid courses, which is one public education strategy, is I will ask participants, how many of you have taken a physical first aid course? And I can tell you nine out of 10 folks put up their hand. So I think that's a common course that we take, or an education course. We all want to know how to respond in case of some kind of physical crisis or emergency.
Yes.
And so, why not mental health first aid as well?
So can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what is the purpose of mental health first aid training?
Sure. Well, Mental Health First Aid is a 12-hour training course, and it was developed to help people provide that initial support when somebody might be experiencing a mental health problem or experiencing a mental health crisis. It was developed in Australia in 2001, and it has been extensively evaluated. And what's really exciting is that evaluation has shown that it does improve people's knowledge of mental illness, it does reduce stigma, and it increases the amount of help that people provide to others. And what I can tell you is, for myself, even me, I've worked in the mental health field for almost 25 years now. And when I took my first mental health first aid course about 2.5, 3 years ago, I learned skills that I now use on an ongoing basis. So even though I worked in the field, now I have some concrete tools that I can pull out and use to help support people.
And that's really telling for someone with your level of experience. And here is a 2-day course that is available to the public, is it?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. It's a course that I am an instructor for, and we may get into this as we go through the interview a little bit later, but public is welcome to take the courses. I promote local courses on my website, and also the Mental Health First Aid Canada website lists all of the mental health first aid courses happening across the nation.
And so can you tell us why people might be interested in mental health first aid?
Yeah. Well, and you and I talked a little bit about it already, that, we take a physical first aid course. So why not a mental health first aid course? When we think of the prevalence, when we think of the rates of mental health concerns in our current culture, it really makes sense to know how to support people. It is an evidence-based certification program, so people do receive a certificate at the end of the course. Just to be aware, it doesn't train people to be a therapist, just like physical first aid doesn't teach you to be a doctor or a nurse, but it does give you those initial skills that you can use to help support, friends, colleagues, loved ones, or even strangers.
And I can say, as someone who's benefited from being in one of your training sessions, I felt like I walked away with some very easy to implement strategies. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little more about what some of the areas are. What are we going to learn in the training?
Sure. Well, part of the 2 days includes an introduction to health and mental illness. And then we go into a variety of modules where we look at substance-related disorders or addictions and substance misuse. We learn about mood disorders. We learn about anxiety and psychotic disorders and illnesses. And so under each of those modules, we learn, what the illness is, what are some of the signs and symptoms and how to recognize them, what are some of the risk factors. We also learn the mental health first aid action steps, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we also share information about treatment and current resources. In addition, participants also learn the crisis first aid for an overdose, for suicidal behavior, for panic attacks, acute stress reaction, and psychotic episodes. So it really is a very comprehensive course. You might remember feeling a little bit drained at the end of the 2 days because there really is a lot of information packed into those 2 days.
Yet, to your credit, I also walked away feeling energized, which is astounding given the topic and how heavy it is. But you made it fun, you made it interactive, and I was thoroughly engaged throughout the 2 days. So maybe you could tell us more, because one of the things that impressed me was how much thought has gone into making it easy to implement so your average person can use it immediately.
Sure. Just like physical first aid, remember there's the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. There's an acronym to remember what to do. It's no different with mental health first aid. The acronym is ALGE, which you probably remember, Anne. And those are the 5 basic action steps or the ingredients for that supportive soup. So just briefly, I'll talk about them. The A stands for assessing risk of suicide and or harm. And so the first aider learns to assess those risks in another person and also learns if they're concerned about those kinds of risks, exactly what to do and what are the next steps to take. The L is listen non-judgmentally. And people learn to adopt a set of attitudes and listening skills. And again, you might remember, Anne, we had a variety of activities to learn about listening skills, to practice some listening skills, so that ultimately what we want to do is enable the person that we're supporting to feel comfortable, to connect and speak freely. And we know that connection is really important. Having that feeling of connectedness and that someone cares is one of the critical first steps. The G is give reassurance and information. And so what we really want is to let people know that they're not alone. A lot of people who experience mental illness, even though it is so widespread, feel very much alone and ashamed and sometimes embarrassed and don't come out and talk about it. So part of mental health first aid is really reassuring folks, you know what, you are not alone, that this is a real medical condition and there are effective treatments out there. And above all, letting people know that there is hope and optimism, because that's critical to recovery. And then the E in ALGE, the first one is to encourage a person to get appropriate professional help. And so in the course, we talk about the professional helps and supports that are out there and how to direct a person to that help. And the final E is to encourage other supports. And again, to build that tool belt, we need to not only seek professional supports, but build in other supports such as family, friends, feeling connected with our community, physical activity, and so on.
And I think it does a great deal to break down the veil of secrecy or shame around disclosing, and reduces people's fear when they're presented with someone who they think might be facing some mental health challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a nice thing in the workshop is that we get to practice, a lot of those skills. We had case studies, and I don't know if you remember doing a little bit of role playing so that you can really
very well.
Yeah, you really get an opportunity to practice using some of those skills.
I can say, as someone that's been in the field of mental health and different aspects of social services, I found those exercises you used very powerful, and it opened my eyes
Oh, good.
as well.
Good.
So I highly recommend it to all of our listeners and to anyone you know who might be interested to let them know that this course exists. And if people want more information, where could they go?
Well, they could go to my website. As I say, that's where I post any local training opportunities. So my website is www.SuzanneWitt-Foley, it's all one word, .com. Another great place to look is the Mental Health First Aid website of Canada, and that's www.mentalhealthfirstaid.ca. And on that website, all of the mental health first aid training opportunities are listed for all across Canada.
Wonderful. So we will get that on our Facebook page for our listeners. If they weren't able to scratch down those addresses, they will be posted. You can get them at our Facebook page for Transitions. And I just want to thank you. You've really raised a lot of important issues. You've given us some ideas about where to start and how people can get involved. And this has been wonderful.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
And so again, listeners, if you're interested, you can reach us with your questions or comments at transitions@hbr@gmail.com. That's transitions@hbr@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.